Hello, and welcome to our video presentation. We hope this brief talk serves as a gentle entry point into our article in TRC titled Theorizing Necropolitics in Social Studies Education. My name is Breton Varga, and I am an assistant professor of history and social science at California State University, Chico. I'm here today with my colleagues and dear friends, Catherine Van Kessel from Texas Christian University and Becky Christ from Florida International University. As a team of co-authors, we are all very close and feel that our scholarly group is incomplete as we record this. We're deeply missing the wonderful Mark Helmsing, who is enduring health-related complications. We miss you, we love you, Mark, and we hope we do our work justice. Even though you are not here, you're always still with us. As a collective, the four of us write and talk a lot about death, grieving, and hauntings within the broader context of social studies education. And perhaps one of the main arguments that we make in our work together is that while social studies seems to be always talking about the dead, the lost, and forgotten, a direct acknowledgement and confrontation with these registers rarely occurs. We are of shared mind that glossing over death and all of its entanglements has an impact on how students see the world, insofar that it restricts their capacity to think critically about the question, why do some get to live and some get to die? This essential question was posed by political theorist Achille Mbembe and serves as the impetus for his theoretical framework, Necropolitics, that seeks to make sense of conditions and relationships that lead to the senseless deaths of certain groups of people time and time again.
So what is necropolitics? In short, necropolitics are the political and social machinations of power that determine who lives and who dies. Mbembe's necropolitics is underpinned by Foucault's concept of biopower, which is a nation's power to control life with a common purpose of prolonging or denying death. Biopolitics, then, is how life is regulated and controlled through political measures, resulting in certain lives considered to be more significant than others. Those wielding biopower organize, regulate, classify, surveil, and control lives. So in curriculum, we'll see this in the Nazis' ghettoization, deportation, medical testing, and genocide of Jews. We see that in US logic of manifest destiny and the genocide of indigenous peoples. We also see that in US treatment of immigrant lives as disposable and so on. We also see this in social studies classrooms, in universalizing standardized assessments, controlling when students can void their bodily fluids, and the microfascisms of citizenship education. Biopolitics and biopower, although they are generative concepts, are insufficient on their own to explain contemporary manifestations of state-sponsored death and how understandings, attitudes towards, and feelings for state-sponsored death manifest when learning about the world. This insufficiency, in part, is repaired by Mbembe's concept of necropolitics. The concept of necropolitics to conceptualize or reconceptualize how positionings of power hold domain over aspects of life through death is an important one. Mbembe is clear that necropolitics is not meant to reify a binary between life and death, but rather it works in concert with biopower by taking up a different vantage point on matters related to life, death, and sovereignty. As previously noted, biopower is primarily concerned with manifestations of power springing from social issues within a population. However, necropolitics operates along a distinct trajectory that, through a reconceptualization of sovereignty, seeks to expose how sovereign power works to exert control over life and death. Important to this suggestion is how sovereign power is imbued with terror, in turn enabling terror to become normalized and conflated with reason and logic. The context of death, so who, how, what, and where, underpin the concept of sovereignty by highlighting how a governing body can wield the terror of death through the active participation of its constituents and the material destruction of human bodies to achieve political gains.
We'd like to take a moment to unpack each of the main concepts used in our article. The concepts are sovereign necropower, conceptualized by Mbembe, living dead, also conceptualized by Mbembe, and slow death, conceptualized by Berlant. Sovereign necropower helps us reconceptualize how positionings of power hold domain over aspects of life through death. So it helps reveal, quote, who matters and who does not, end quote, in seeking to expose how sovereign power works to exert control over life and death. Again, necropolitics is not meant to reify a binary between life and death, but rather it works in concert with biopower by taking up a different vantage point on matters related to life, death, and sovereignty. And at the heart of sovereignty lies structures that bear responsibility for the racialization of people. In our article, we use the example of the French Revolution to help further unpack this concept. Now, onto the concept of the living dead. According to Mbembe, necropolitics or necropower can, quote, account for the various ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of maximally destroying persons and creating death worlds. That is, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. The status of living dead can originate in the complexities of history that lead to living conditions that ultimately lead to death, acts of dehumanization, and geopolitical standings that mark some as less worthy than others. In short, it is where populations of people are subjected by a nation's power to determine life and death. Relatedly, slow death refers to the physical wearing out of a population and the deterioration of people in that population that is very nearly a defining condition of their experience and historical existence. It appears in instances that could easily be mistaken as ordinary matter-of-fact happenings. Thus, it often occurs outside the more immediately identifiable and starkly visible forms of necropolitical death, such as drone bombing, capital punishment, or forced occupation. And because slow death occurs through mundane and ordinary practices, occurring slowly over time, the markers of slow death are easy for students to ignore or not see. Both concepts of living dead and slow death bring a temporal aspect to discussions of sovereign necropower and how that terror deteriorates individuals and communities. In our article, we use the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda to unpack both the concepts of the living dead and slow death. We think these two concepts can also help students begin to think about the irreparable and lasting damage that genocides cause and the hauntings they continue to produce for both victims and perpetrators of extreme violence.
To demonstrate how each of these concepts operate, our article uses three commonly traversed social studies topics: depictions of violence and death from the French Revolution, violence and death during the Vietnam War, and violence and death regarding U.S. histories of racial segregation. The first example asks, which deaths are unacceptable, and is used in the article to observe sovereign necropower. Specifically, this example recounts a classroom lesson on the Reign of Terror and deaths that unfolded there within. The lesson begins with the teacher showing his class a slide of this engraving on the screen, and then making the claim that the Reign of Terror's violence was exceptional and regrettable. Using a necropolitical analysis of how the Reign of Terror was framed as a regrettable state brings into focus the historical tendency to ignore, forget, or otherwise exclude the power the state had to sanction death prior to the events of the French Revolution. Put simply, approaching the outcome of the Reign of Terror as simply being the mass murder of anyone who stood in the way of those in charge of the French Revolution oversimplifies the role the government had in determining who gets to live and who gets to die.
Our second example in our article is the teacher's curricular and pedagogical choices while teaching about the Vietnam War. He presented U.S. military soldiers as martyrs. Necropolitics makes use of martyrdom narratives and framings to encourage sacrificing lives for a political cause, for justifying revenge and retribution of a state power, and preventing oppositional forces antagonistic to sovereign power from gaining acceptance by the public. The opposite side of the necropolitical coin is how Vietnamese people were portrayed in the lesson. The teacher showed photographs of extreme violence, including 2 people in the midst of their own deaths. These bodies of fellow humans were put on display for students without any forewarning or prefacing to indicate these images could be disturbing, which was in contrast with the prefacing for the violent images of US citizens. Likely unintentionally, the material destruction of bodies, American, but especially Vietnamese bodies, functioned only in relation to the US government achieving or not achieving its political gains. Necropolitics explains the policies and behaviors of the US government during the war, and attention to the necropolitical situation can help us as educators pivot away from dehumanizing narratives that disrespect our fellow humans. It's important for the Vietnam War and for any necropolitical topic to be really attentive to the images we use, as well as how we explain death to our students.
The third example asks, whose deaths are made absent or visible? To demonstrate the concept of slow death. This example follows a 9th grade US history unit entitled The History of the Rights Movements, which culminates in a lesson on the necropolitical action of redlining. The prior lessons of the unit discussed economic and governmental policies that not only affected the lives of Black individuals and families, but also entire communities and neighborhoods throughout the US North, including the community surrounding their school. To conceptualize these policies further, the teacher organized a field trip to drive students through the surrounding neighborhoods. At one point, the teacher identified a wall that had been erected to physically separate a new white housing development from a mixed neighborhood, which had the effect of making the nearby school a Black school. And the teacher noted where the interstate was literally built on top of Black housing and establishments. Because slow death appears in instances that could be easily mistaken as ordinary or matter-of-fact happenings, such as Berlant says, with the privatization of schools and public metropolitan spaces and the pushing out of the political from the concepts of publicness. And in this case, policies of segregation, such as redlining, teachers and students can use the concept of slow death to reveal who lives and who dies and how such deaths are allowed to unfold in a particular community or society.
We are hopeful that each of these examples helps readers understand how necropolitics can provide a way to address the intersecting complexities between life, death, political alliance, and power. We also believe that the logics underwriting necropolitics provides educators and students with conceptual tools for acknowledging, confronting, and interrogating the deadly workings of power that continue to shape and reshape how life is experienced for different groups of people. As we have retraced throughout this article, social studies, pedagogy, curriculum, and instances involving historical and contemporary registers beyond the classroom is brimming with accounts, examples, and circumstances tethered to death. While we acknowledge that it is not feasible for educators to pause every time an entanglement of death arises, we do think educators can equip students with necropolitical tools that would allow them to analyze the nuances contributing before, during, and after death has occurred. Such tools could then be leveraged into questions like, to what end are the deaths of certain people political acts meant to proliferate terror? What other acts contributed to the socio-political assemblage of violence? Which countries both directly and indirectly allowed, caused, or supported the creation of the death world? What role has history played in the unfolding of contemporary death? And how have certain deaths been rationalized in order to enhance the living of specific people? We hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to necropolitics, and we would love to know how this article has pushed your thinking about the importance of confronting contexts related to death, dying, and grief. Thanks for watching. See you next time.